What up, and welcome back to another Malazan Book of the Fallen video. This time we're doing chapters 13 and 14 of Deadhouse Gates. We're making our big push. We're going to wrap this book up soon. And the chapters just keep getting quicker, more fast paced, juicier, and lots of spoilers. So let's get into it. All right, as per usual, we're going to go through the chapter in a kind of non-spoilery, just review, analysis, reaction kind of way, and then I'm going to tell you when to jump out if you're a newbie so that the Malazan vets and I can really get into those juicy spoilers. And actually, this chapter 13 kicks off with two of my favorite characters of the entire series. We got Bent and Roach. So Roach actually gets jacked by Bent from Nephthara, and apparently he was like this big, expensive, Hanganese lapdog, and Bent took a liking to her and straight up jacked it. Diker's there, and he actually stops this noble from beating his servant super bad. And these nobles, Diker paints a really big picture of these guys being just like the total stereotypical dicks and entitled. And there's just this huge kind of conflict or tension brewing because, like, on the one hand, the whole purpose of the army, and the seventh, at least Coltain's mission, is to protect these refugees. But then in order to do that, they have to basically take priority in everything, in the water, in the food rations, in terms of, all of just the logistical aspects. And so there's this whole kind of resentment building amongst the entitled nobles who think that they're being kind of done dirty, or it's unfair that the troops get all this stuff and they don't get anything. And so there's just this kind of fundamental conflict built into the nature of that relationship because, of course, to survive, you've got to have the army they're defending, and that means kind of giving them some unfair treatment, which means you get these folks who are being protected ultimately that kind of hate and complain about the army itself. And so it's just this whole weird dichotomy and kind of vicious circle or cycle that keeps happening. And at the same time, right, there's a lot of like bitterness and resentment on the part of the army. Like, here they are fighting, dying, they're having their homies die all the time and like continue to surmount these ridiculous odds, and yet these ingrateful nobles, refugees that you're trying to protect ultimately and putting everything on the line for is really giving you no cause to do so, right? Because they're just treating you like crap. They don't appreciate you. And so again, just beautifully written kind of dynamic that's happening, and just kind of very realist kind of point of view built in. And again, just why I love the series. But he just does a great job of not showing you this whole ordeal through kind of rose-colored glasses, but giving you some of the realities and just those fundamental conflicts, again, that would be baked into an ordeal like something like a refugee train like this. We also see Diker again getting hollered at by his nameless marine again. They also talk about Pearl's intervention at the Semp camp when they get to the command tent with Coltaine and stuff like that, and everybody is just kind of freaked out because they talk about App's handiwork and how there was some kind of a demon there as well, and really just, they're grateful for the help, I guess, but at the same time just like deeply suspicious, like what else is going on. There's these undercurrents that they obviously don't know about. And Panic in particular, the kind of boy that App adopts at the end of, I don't think it was the last chapter, it was a couple episodes ago, set of chapters, maybe like 8 or 9, when he stepped in and Apt actually got Shadow Throne to resurrect the kids and turn one of them into Apt's kind of like adopted kid. That super freaked out Nil. But Diker reports on like all these beatings that the nobles are administering on their servants now that they got him back, and Coltaine basically orders Bolt too. And this is just like such a brilliant move that I just love to death, because he basically gets Bolt to go and co-opt all of the servants, because when they had used him before, they're like, oh, we'll sell you the servants, but you got to pay us and blah, blah, blah. Coltane's like, dude, get rid of all the gold that we have and use it to pay face value for all of these servants, because A, we need the manpower and they're getting abused, right? And B, this gold is a burden to schlep around. And they're like, whoa, but isn't that like our pay and all this stuff? And he's like, yeah, but the Empire will honor the debts. If they want to call this gold around, we'll make it their problem. And just in one foul swoop, like solves two tactical issues and one strategic one, right? By getting rid of all the weight that he had to carry around that the army was burdened with on the gold front, and B, getting a bunch of his ranks built, and C, kind of on the strategic front, just building that loyalty and, solidarity and cohesion, and just showing what a kind of badass leader Coltane is. And following along with that, he comes by Diker's tent later on, and, Diker again is filled with all these doubts and just the seeming impossibility of what they're up against. And he, is asking Coltane what's going to happen, and he's talking about all the strategy and stuff. And Diker's like, what about this enemy that we're going to face tomorrow? And Coltane's like, oh, that one we already got on lock, homie. He's like, I'm thinking about the challenges 3 to 4 to 5 weeks down the road. And so he's just very much playing chess, not checkers.
It's chess, it ain't checkers.
And thinking on a much longer time frame, and that really took Diker aback. And again, I think just speaks to what a tactical genius, even though he's like kind of a savage, a tribesman. There's no formal education there, or anything like that. Just an absolute genius, like strategist and tactician. And for this battle, they have like a really ingenious plan, basically, to turn the Foolish Dog clan into heavy infantry or heavy cavalry. So they have all this armor for them and their horses that they've literally never used. They designed it to fight the Empire way back in the day, but they're going to roll that out this time. Diker's pessimistic, and actually Lull even calls him out again. Lull's like, dude, what is your problem, bro? And then as they're preparing, we also find out that the sappers just totally dipped out in the middle of the night. Some of the captains are super pissed off, thinking that they deserted, and so something's definitely going on there. The nobles come by again and are all pissed as usual. This time they're pissed because they're getting left behind, because basically what they have to do is like cross a river and then charge up a whole big old long ramp and take on the enemy army, and there's no room for them to be there worrying about the refugees at the same time. But we really just get like so many killer epic battles in these couple of chapters. We have the wounded who also get left behind at the back with just like a modest contingent of folks, and it looks like all the time they're going to get crushed, and they're being crushed in from all sides, and then they'll like explode out somehow and manage to repel, and they do that many times. Diker's right up in the mix, scrapping too, and as they're scrapping, his like nameless marine chick is hollering at him, telling him how bad she wants to ride him after this battle. And so there's this whole like close to death, need to live life to the fullest kind of element happening, I guess. And then as they're like slowly working their way up this big long ramp, Nil and Nether creep up, and they're like leading this horse by the reins. They put their hands on the side of this horse, and all of a sudden that Foolish Dog heavy cavalry just starts surging.
What the hell was that all about?
And as they surge up this hill, we get to see like what the sappers were up to, because they basically were up there and had buried themselves at the top of this ramp in the middle of the night. And so they spring up and start softening up the front line of this Camus Relo elite force that's up there, and just, wreaking havoc basically. And then right at the last minute, they duck back down and kind of turtle shell it with their shields, and let the Foolish Dogs just ride right through these troops and just absolutely destroy. And so again, just somehow, despite the odds and just the terrible, position on the field, and the literal uphill battle, and the lack of numbers and rest, and the burden of the refugees and all of that they, again succeed despite these incredible odds, and come together. And even though, Diker's not hopeful all the time, it's, constantly exceeding his expectations. And this is when they get the name, the Chain of Dogs.
He leads, yet is led. He strains forward, yet is held back. He bares his fangs, yet what nips at his heels, if not those he is sworn to protect?
We also see Captain Lull, who's like just such an awesome character during these last couple chapters, gets completely jacked. His whole like thing, he's like maimed. He lost like half his face, an eyeball. Yeah, he is jacked.
Damn!
The other thing, and it's just so painful because as the reader, we know this, but nobody else does, right? And they're just such unsung heroes. But the Weasel clan, who is, basically tasked with protecting the refugees in order to kind of spring this crazy trap and actually win the day, which they did, they had to basically sacrifice some of the refugees, or some of the refugees died in the process of them springing this trap. But that was what enabled them to literally save the thousands and thousands and thousands of other refugees. But they're getting so much flack for that and hate from the nobles, and they don't defend themselves at all. They just are very stoic and say nothing and take it on the chin. And that's further interpreted as like, oh, they don't even care that they just murdered all of us. And so just, such a total misinterpretation of what's happening. And you really see that they, just have such a moral code that they're holding themselves to, and they, feel bad about it, but they don't make excuses for it, right? They accept the responsibility, and it's just a really interesting juxtaposition of, and commentary, I guess, on the two different types of societies where, yeah, I guess I'll leave that there. And it ends on some of like the craziest, best symbolism, and just, pulls at those heartstrings, because we see Nil and Nether, who still have their hands on the sides, on the flanks of this horse, and basically the horse has had its blood boiled inside of its bones, and they, use the entirety of this thing's life force to fuel this, ungodly, inhuman surge of the foolish dogs up this ramp that enabled them to actually crush Camus Relo on the day. And it just takes a toll on them, right? Because they know the sacrifice that they led this poor animal to. Diker sees it too, and sees what it does to them. And it's just a very like brutal scene, because it's just, you see what this journey and what, even though they're achieving the impossible and constantly defy the odds, the toll is adding up, right? It's starting to cost more and more and more from a human standpoint, with the death and the body counts for the emotions and the trauma for the people who are still left alive, and yet they keep going. But it's just getting so hard.
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine, but you just can't get into it because they would never understand.
And then the chapter ends with Callum, who's going through the Imperial Warren. He finds like all this debris and stuff that has Calor's sigil on it, which is a guy that we heard about briefly in Gardens of the Moon, who they were fighting up in the Black Dog Forest, and the kind of, flashbacks to what was happening before the beginning of actually Gardens of the Moon. And he's freaked out because he knows that Dujek and Whiskey Jack and all those guys are currently making deals with Kaladin Brood back in Darujistan, right? That was part of what we learned at the end of Gardens of the Moon. Their whole plan was to really link up with them to fight this other Pani and Seer guy. And so he's just all tripped out because Calor was talking about how old he is, and being thousands and thousands of years old, and having run his own empires. And Callum is in the Imperial Warren, and he's finding like actual corroborating evidence of that all over on the ground. But he also is able to work out how to get him out of the Imperial Warren, which is just basically a function of will. And so he gets them to outside of Aaron. They make their way into Aaron, into a bar, and he is approached by this captain guy. And somebody named Salk Elan has arranged for him to get transport back to Unta on this captain's ship. Neither Callum nor the captain has ever heard of this guy Salk Ilan, but and Callum is obviously mad suspicious of both, but he decides to take him up on his ride to Unta because that's where he's headed to fulfill his ultimate mission. Minala also decides to go after him, and then the other thing we learn is because Lostara and Pearl come out outside of Aaron as well, and she goes to have a look around and report in with the Red Blades and ends up getting arrested because we find that the Red Blades have now been outlawed by Pormqual and Malik Rel.
Are you kidding me?
And then we pick up in chapter 14 with Culp, Boric, and Felison, and they're all still hiding out in this kind of preservation cave. Culp does a lot of speculating on what's happening with the Path of Hands and thinks that somebody who, started that and wonders what the motivation could be there. They eat some of that preservation fruit too, and then they start to get on their way, essentially, and get out of there. Boric has, all these moments of consciousness. They stumble on this deck of dragons, but not really a deck of dragons, but it's kind of measuring the old magic system, the holds, and Boric actually comments on how the beast hold, or the antlered throne, is currently not occupied, and then he straight up proceeds to go big and climb him down this giant cliff face with his bare hands, with his ghost hands that aren't even there, right, and just jamming them into the wall and climbing them down.
Like a wall. Oh yes, I keep the bank rolling.
And they're literally climbing down into the whirlwind, right? So this storm is literally like eating the skin and flesh off their bones. And so they're basically about to die when they're rolled up on by this guy, Nawal Ibur, right? And he's this big old giant fat, like morbidly obese dude being carried around on a palanquin by these dead and rotting like zombie dudes. He claims to be a servant of Sheikh, but ultimately he says he's just like a merchant of magical goods. He actually gives Felison this like magical salve stuff, and she puts it on, and immediately like her skin grows back, and she doesn't have all the crazy pockmarks and all that stuff. He's actually hollering at her the whole time too, and she's even like considering it actually.
Shame. Shame. Shame.
But this guy, Nawal Ibur, has some kind of like a magical barrier up that's protecting him so that the whirlwind can't penetrate, but it's being like assailed by divers and soul taken on all sides, and they're almost getting in, and it's flustering him, but they're basically safe from the effect of the whirlwind and the Path of Hands in there. And ultimately, Culp's getting super suspicious, and he starts to like try and point out that like these divers are going to make it in eventually. And this Nawal guy turns into just like a bunch of, he was obviously a divers, and split off into like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of rats and starts to attack and immediately just like eats and kills Culp. Boric busts out his like karate chops of fire with his ghost hands and starts like fighting off the rats everywhere, and he's like doing something, but he's ultimately about to get overwhelmed, and then like out of nowhere Bowden shows up. He kind of puts Boric together with Felison and gives him a shove to get him on their way. And then he grabs this lantern and just like straight up busts it over his head, like Mary Shelley Frankenstein style, and just dives into these rats to try and like burn them all out. Felison gets Boric out and he's hurt bad. They roll up on Bowden, who just shows up straight up completely cooked. And he thought that after going through that warren, with Stormy and Gessler and flying in the wake of that dragon and being gilded and all of that stuff, that he was immune to fire, and he ultimately obviously wasn't. He tries to take his last couple minutes too to like fill Felison in on Tavor's plan, but Felison really doesn't want to hear it, and so he just ultimately dies, and that is that.
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
We also get in chapter 14 Fiddler, Crocus, Mappo, and Icarium, all following Sari and Servant through Raraku, basically, to try and get to the Whirlwind Gate, right? Or the Sheikh's encampment, or whatever it is. Fiddler wonders, like, maybe she's doing it to try and help him and Callum with their plan, right? That maybe she's going to take over this whirlwind rebellion and help them with their ultimate goal of getting even with Lysine. And ultimately, they're just doing a lot of speculating about what she's up to and what's going to happen. And he's worried, right? Because if she takes over, then you've basically got a 7 cities rebellion that's being led by an agent of Shadow who is bitter about being assassinated from the former Empress. And does that mean this kind of bigger thing than just kind of a revenge scheme against Lysine, but actually a bigger conflict for the whole empire itself, which we know that Fiddler is like still loyal to, but he just wants a better leader in there. And then we end chapter 14 back with Shake, or at least with her body, right? Things are looking pretty rough. They're still like standing their vigil, but Leomin hasn't eaten in a long time. The Toblakai keeps trying to get him to eat, and everything is just going super rough and losing hope very fast and just very disillusioned that this whole rebellion that they've worked towards their whole entire lives had just, seemingly disappears when Shake gets assassinated. And basically right when it looks like Leomin's about to lose it and everything is toast, we see that Felison and Heboric come mobbing through the gates, just looking super rough. But he recognizes that she has some kind of a similarity to Shake, and he pronounces her the Shake Reborn. The Toblakai goes down on one knee, and basically we get a fade to black with her taking over as the leader, I guess, of this whirlwind rebellion.
I didn't see that coming.
So just a ton of stuff happening with the Wickans, with Fiddler, Sari chasing Apsalar, and just all of the implications, not necessarily the action of what's happening, but the implications of what, this all means and, the bigger game that's being played. And so we'll go ahead and leave the regular chapter stuff here. So if you don't want spoilers, now is your chance to bounce out. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you on the next one. All right, and now for the spoilery goodness, right, of which there's a lot. The first thing, and this is just kind of a funny gripe, and actually Diker's one of my favorite characters, but as I'm rereading this now for the third time or plus, it just strikes me that, and I get it, he's the one who's meant to convey the incredible odds, the hopelessness of the journey that they're on. But man, if you reading and knowing what I know now, you kind of, it's funny just because he's always the Debbie Downer, and he's like a revered character and people really vibe with him as empathetic and compassionate, and he is all of those things, but it's like his viewpoint is always like, we're gonna lose, we're screwed, there's nothing we can do, oh my gosh, we're all gonna die. And so it's just a funny, and I personally love Diker, but it's just funny how he really is, if you just step back and look objectively, he's like this total like complainer, Debbie Downer, wet blanket of the party when other people are like there and trying to like push through and actually win and succeed.
Evening, everyone. I thought it would be very droll if we all sat down and looked at etchings.
The other thing that I missed in here, and maybe you guys picked this up, I'm curious to know in the comments, but Chened, who is one of the other captains besides Lull and the Red Blade captain, I forget that guy's name, but then there was the one who was cozying up to the nobles, but then there's one named Chened who, and I guess I totally missed this the first couple times, but his dad was part of Dasim's first sword, and I don't know how I ever missed that or didn't know that. Do you guys know who the dad was, and just why didn't we get to see more of Chened? Because that makes me think dude was a straight up badass, and it also makes me just like really want to again bring up this idea of animating that Yucatan first sword battle with the champion of Yucatan, because that would just make for the most epic visual animation or CG or whatever. I just want to see somebody do that. The other kind of spoilery thing that I'll bring up in this one, and I know this video is going on for a long time, but somebody said that they heard empathy and compassion wasn't a big theme for the Malazan books, and I never get into like the deep technical stuff of writing these books, but I think that's total BS.
'Cause baby, now we got bad blood.
Because if it wasn't about empathy and compassion and stuff, why would it be told from Diker's standpoint? Why wouldn't it be told from the nobles and from the soldier standpoint, where they're bitter and fighting each other, and the hatred and the resentment that's building up? Like, by having it through Diker's eyes, he really gets the sacrifice that Nil and Nether make, right? The toll in terms of death, the stuff with List, and the compassion that he has for this ancient Jagat who's trying to get his story out there via List. And the whole thing with the Chain of Dogs is to make us feel for the soldiers, to feel for Coltane, who's just unloved, and all of that stuff. And just seeing how they're the Weasel clan, who just takes all that abuse on the chin for having let those refugees die, and not saying, hey, you dicks, we just saved 25,000 of you. They're doing it. They respect the anger and take the responsibility. I don't know, for me, this book's has tons of empathy and compassion, and makes you really put yourself in those people's shoes and feel that pain and hurt and suffer through the misunderstandings and all of that, because you have the information that the other sides don't have, and so you feel it even more acutely, therefore. So that one's just more, I guess, of a gripe. But then we also get to meet Carther on Crust for the first time, and I guess that totally went over my head last time, too, that we had actually met Carther on Crust, because he doesn't show up until much later in the books, and definitely until the Ice books and stuff. And so just really cool, and actually such a killer character that I forgot about him on the journey with Callum from Seven Cities back to Unta.
You're my boy, Blue!
And then I just kind of love how Culp actually figures out that Shadow Throne was the one who's kind of like, or that somebody, rather, is kind of setting a false trail on the path of hands. He doesn't know that it's Shadow Throne, and he doesn't know that it's to keep people away from the real gate into Emerlin, but he still suspects something is up, and so I just think that's kind of cool and fitting, because it's his lord that's doing it, basically, and that same kind of trickery that he gets from being a mage of Manas and all of that. And so, shout out for Culp. He went down in a blaze of glory, and, he had some pretty cool achievements and was a decent character, but that is a wrap for him. But it's actually also just like a big precursor, right? Setting the fake path of hands or whatever is a precursor of, or him trying to avoid what ultimately ends up having to do later, which is to like have Trull and Quick defending the gate and the throne when the Edur, just whoever, might come and try and usurp. And so you kind of get just these very early foreshadowing of that challenge that he was worried about all along. And so, yeah, just a lot of cool stuff. The stuff is so consequential, and actually the action is building up too, but I love it reading it this time around, just because, again, it's not so fast-paced, the writing, and it might not be the most well-written. Again, I'm terrible to be able to tell you what's the best book or not, because I don't feel qualified to do that, but I love this one because it is so consequential and just setting up all the stuff for the future books. And so we'll leave it there. I look forward to the comments. If you really like chatting about it, join the Discord. Absolutely no pressure. You can leave me a comment here. I try and respond to those as well. You can always buy some merch if you want. You can become a patron. We actually have channel memberships now, so if you want, you can become a member here and use the fancy emojis and all of that stuff. But more than anything else, thank you for the support by watching this video. If you like it, give it a thumbs up. Click that subscribe and notification so that you never miss a video. And until the next one, happy reading.